Okay, Paul, so now the people are coming because we just letting them in from the waiting room. So we can start in a few minutes, I believe, with a 5-minute delay roughly.
Okay.
And I will be the MC. So
All right.
thank you. So Paul, are you ready?
Yes.
So great. So I would like to welcome everyone this evening. And I'm sorry for the delay, but it's pretty new to us that well, already 1,000 people are in the room and we just reached our capacity. And later on, I promise we will find a way to everyone, so everyone can listen to Dr. Paul Clayton and his lecture. But I guess that it's quite a nice problem to have that so many people are we can't wait to listen to Dr. Paul Clayton. So I'm not sure if I need to introduce Dr. Paul Clayton in details, because we are talking about you, Paul, all the time. And as you can see, people are, well, they just want a piece of from your knowledge. And I know that you are always sharing with us some new and fresh thoughts. So I also can't wait to listen to it. And please share some from your past experiences from the past decades. So Paul, thank you for having us, and the floor is all yours tonight.
Hey, it's good to see so many people here. I'm surprised. Good evening, and thank you for being a part of this. I'll talk about a few new things today, but I understand that there are many new guests. So I do have to cover, I'm afraid, many of the basic elements as well. You have to build up the story each time. I can't simply give you the latest little pieces of research, because unless you know the context, the background, it's hard for you to, I think, or for anyone to judge what these little pieces of information mean and how much credibility we should give them. So let me start by sharing my screen. And at this point, I should have a PowerPoint to show you. Let me see if I can just find this. Share screen. Yes, here it is. So we start again with inflammation. It seems we always have to start there because it's become such a universal problem. I think you know that we have a situation where the public health is very bad, where bad diet has been identified as the most important factor in causing ill health. And what I'm going to do this evening is to show you how it is that the diet that we eat today causes three basic problems. One of those is chronic inflammatory stress. One of them is type B malnutrition. And the third is dysbiosis. And those three problems together account for the bulk of the burden of chronic ill health that we see around us today. And those three pillars, those three systems, we can address. In fact, that is what the Zinzino portfolio is designed to do. There is one other element that is also important in contributing to this huge problem of public ill health, and that is insulin resistance and low levels of physical activity. Now, we don't really have a solution for that. In order to change that, you simply have to change your lifestyle, incorporate more exercise into your regime. Well, that's only a half-truth, because we have identified an extract in a herb from China and Korea, which, when you eat it, it actually tricks the body into thinking that you are taking exercise. This is not a stimulant, but it actually changes the metabolism in the same way that we see when people take exercise. It's a herb called Gynastemna pentaphyllum. The Chinese name, some of you may know, it's jiaogulan. And this is, one way of looking at it is to say that this is exercise in a capsule. Now, we can't actually become involved with this because there's one country in the EU which, for reasons I don't understand, has said that this is not a food or a food extract. Everybody else accepts it, but because we are working in so many countries, we cannot work with this, or at least not yet. Perhaps that's something for the future. But in the meantime, I'll talk about the three problems: inflammation, type B malnutrition, dysbiosis, and I'll show you how they hurt us, and I'll show you how you can neutralize them. So someone is asking for remote control of my screen. Christopher, is that correct?
No, I'm not sure. Just ignore it. So.
Okay, but what that means is, okay, so I have control again. I think maybe I was hacked just for a moment. The reason why we need to consider alternative ways of improving public health, is because the medical system we have now has failed. Now, I don't mean to be critical of medical professionals. I don't mean to be critical of medical training, really. But the problem is we have a system that has its roots in the 19th century and provides us with 19th and 20th century solutions for 21st century problems. It is no longer adequate. And you can see this when you look at public health in countries all over the world. I'll show you data from Australia and Denmark, but really the same is true in all westernized nations. In Australia, you think of the Australians as being healthy outdoors people. That's not really true. Half of all adult Australians have a chronic disease of one sort or another, and about a quarter of them have two or more. The same is true in Denmark. 2 in 3 adult Danes have a chronic health condition. It's a little bit more than Australia, and that's partly to do with the way in which they define these things. And if you look at the last 3 lines, you can see that the numbers of health problems increase as people get older. And that's pretty much what we expect to see. We assume that as we get older, we will become sicker and we will develop the symptoms of more diseases. We think of that as a natural part of aging. But what I'm going to show you in the rest of this presentation is that it's not natural. You don't have to get unhealthier as you get older. And that is really nothing to do with getting older per se. It is in fact the result of chronic poisoning caused by our diet and lifestyle, and it can be avoided. So here's one of the problems. We have an out of control and thoroughly immoral multinational food manufacturing industry, which sells us ultra processed foods, lots of calories, not much nutrition. And because these foods contain little fiber, lots of calories, they don't satiate, we eat too much, and we're physically too inactive. So everybody's getting heavier. And as we get heavier, we become more at risk of many different diseases. You can see here chronic kidney disease, osteoarthritis, asthma, stroke, but I'll really focus on the top, type 2 diabetes. And you can see that the risk increases dramatically as you move from normal weight, where the risk is 1, and the risk doubles and multiplies by 5, by 9, and so on and so forth as you get heavier. And it doesn't really matter if you're taking anti-diabetic medication, your life expectancy is still going to be reduced, because once you have diabetes, it creates glycative and therefore inflammatory stress. And that means that your risk of many types of disease increases, from gastrointestinal tract cancers to end-stage renal disease, kidney disease, liver disease, neuropathies, ophthalmological problems, neurodegenerative problems. The list goes on and on and on. In other words, the aging process is accelerated, and this impacts on life expectancy. And because so many people have diabetes now, thanks to our diet and way of life, life expectancy is falling at national levels now. And I'll show you data to prove that later as well. So here are some health trends that I'm going to quickly go through. And the general point that I want to make is that the chronic degenerative diseases, all of these different kinds, which I'll go through, that almost all of them are becoming more common. They're increasing in frequency, but at the same time, they're decreasing in latency, which means we see them emerging in younger and younger groups of patients. So when I went to medical school in 1968, we were taught that type 2 diabetes was a disease of old age. Not true anymore. We're now seeing it in 20-year-old teenagers and preteens. Because diabetes increases the risk of many other conditions, such as non-alcohol related fatty liver disease and renal disease, those health problems are increasing too, occurring in younger groups of patients. Hypertension, it's part of that metabolic syndrome, also increasing. That's 2000 data. By 2020, that figure has now increased to almost 2/3 of all American adults. And then relatively not serious, but still a problem when you have these cataracts. People are presenting for cataract surgery much earlier than they used to, partly because people have different criteria for seeking surgery, but also because there are so many more diabetics, and diabetics are appearing younger and younger. The diabetic has increased risk of cataract, so the demand for cataract surgery also going up. Diabetes also increases the risk of various neurodegenerative conditions, including dementias. They've increased quite dramatically. And if you look at the second line, The average age of onset of dementia has fallen by 15 years, really in the last generation. And because people are developing neurodegenerative diseases at earlier ages than they used to, and because we really have no drugs to treat these conditions at all, apart from minor symptoms, and because these diseases get worse with time, what that means is in the older age groups, more people are dying of them. So you can see in men, they've increased by 300% and in women by 500%. Those figures are pretty awful, but we know that they're going to continue to increase because depression increases the risk of dementia. Dementia is now regarded as being a neuroprogressive disorder. In other words, it's not harmless, it's not something that comes and goes, but it actually causes a degree of neurological damage. And the problem here is that depression is increasing too. Again, it's occurring in younger and younger groups. And rather as the age of onset of dementia has fallen 15 years since 1980, you can see here that the age when people start showing the first signs of serious depressive illness has fallen by 16 years over roughly the same time period. So we're going to see more people with neurodegenerative diseases, with dementia certainly in the future, and obesity is another risk factor here. That increases the risk of dementia by up to 300%. We're seeing more people who have weight problems, so that too will filter through finally to increased numbers of patients with dementia. Now, for the sake of balance and fairness, I have to say that the Alzheimer's Cohorts Consortium reports a negative trend at the moment, but I believe for the factors that I've just listed, that this will prove to be an anomaly and that figures will continue to increase. So something in our environment is causing neurological damage and dysfunction in later life. It's also affecting us at the beginnings of life. I think many of you are familiar with the concept of these neurodevelopmental disorders increasing. There's real increases here in all of that constellation, that group of neurodevelopmental disorders. Moving away from the central nervous system to connective tissue, there has been a significant increase in what are known as low impact fractures, which indicate that bones are not as robust as they used to be. And there is some evidence that there has been a degradation in cartilage chemistry as well. Now, there's data on increasing requirements for knee and hip replacement. That's certainly contributed to by the fact that we're getting heavier. We're loading these weight-bearing joints more than we did. But there is some evidence of a deterioration in cartilage chemistry, which was actually first being talked about almost 20 years ago, and is still below the surface, but I think the evidence is quite good. The immune system. Now, everybody knows, I think, how much more common asthma is. The average now in many countries is that in primary schools and in some secondary schools, approximately 1 in 3, 1 in 4, 1 in 5 in different children in different countries of children are going to school with inhalers. When I went to school in 1955, a very large school with, I think, 2,000 children. Amongst those 2,000 children, there was only one boy with asthma. That's how much the landscape has changed. And for doctors who are working every day, trying to cope up with the demands for their time, the huge numbers of patients who are presenting to them every day, I think that they don't see the wood for the trees. They don't all understand the historical context, and they don't all see how profoundly abnormal the current situation is. Eosinophilic gastrointestinal disorders, less familiar perhaps, but you can think of these as allergies affecting the gastrointestinal tract. They've dramatically increased, and there is evidence for a fairly widespread increase in the incidence of all of the 100+ autoimmune diseases. Cancers have doubled, non-tobacco related, that is. And one of them in particular, non-tobacco related lung cancer, has doubled since 2012. Not the most common of cancers, but the trend is very significant indeed. And it's not because we're getting older as a population. There's evidence that actually life expectancy is falling now. And the cancers in teens and young adults have also doubled, which kind of really demolishes the idea that we're seeing more cancer because we're getting older. We're not. One of those cancers, bowel cancer, in a relatively young group of adults, 22 to 37, has quadrupled since 1974. In this group, bowel cancer is not very common. Numerically, this is not hugely significant, but once again, the trends are very significant. So those people who do not yet have these conditions, have not yet been diagnosed, congratulations, but I do not think that you should be too complacent, because all of the diseases that I've just been running through, all of them have long latency periods. That is, they are growing and gathering force for many, many years, in fact, decades, before they finally get so severe that they break through the reserves of tissue that the evolutionary process has gifted us with and emerge in the surface as a clinical symptom. By the time a doctor sees a patient with arthritis, supposing your knee starts to hurt, you have arthritis, you go to see the doctor, you have had that deterioration of cartilage on your knees probably for 20, 30, or maybe 40 years, a slow continuing erosion. By the time the doctor gets to know about it, that disease has blossomed into its mature clinical form. It's late in the disease, and all they can do at that point is to give you non-steroidal anti-inflammatories or some of the new biologicals to improve the situation, but it's always too little and too late. And that's true with many other diseases. So for example, if we go through this list, if we look at healthy young populations or populations who think they're healthy, what we find is that about a fifth of them have the beginnings of progressive liver disease, about a quarter are moving towards osteoporosis, at least a fifth already are moving towards coronary artery disease, and if I were to include diabetics in that group, it would be more than half. About a fifth are starting to move towards dementia, and at least a half, and this is in a young group, 40 to 49, are moving towards sarcopenia and metabesity. And these are serious health problems. Now, you might think again that this is because we're getting older, we're developing these slowly burning conditions, and that's just the way things have to be. No, it's not, and the reason why we know it's not is that if we look at populations who live in vestigial cultures, that is, out-of-the-way places, remote parts of the world, where people live something like a hunter-gatherer lifestyle, where they do not eat Western processed foods, they do not age in the way that we do. Their bodies do not deteriorate in the way that ours do. So, for example, we find that if you look at these people, take a young adult from one of these cultures who has died from trauma, open them up, look at the coronary arteries, they do not show, as we do, the signs of developing coronary artery disease. And as they get older, their blood pressure does not rise. Their insulin sensitivity does not deteriorate. They do not become obese. These sorts of changes, which we think of as normal, are nothing of the kind. They are an artifact caused by our lifestyle. And it's our poor diet that is the most important cause of this. That's recognized by some of the most authoritative medical bodies in the world. Now, one of the main problems that this diet causes is chronic inflammation. And this is a little diagram, a very simplified diagram of what happens in one of your immune cells. Here it's a macrophage, or it could be a neutrophil or a monocyte, when you have chronic inflammatory stress. And I don't want to go into the details, interesting though they are. What I'm going to look at is the inflammasome at the bottom. That's that red bar at the bottom, which is where the immune cell is producing substances which lead to the slow, progressive, ongoing destruction of healthy tissue. That is the core of chronic degenerative disease. So here's one way of looking at it. This is that parallel line of two parallel lines at the top of the slide. That's your typical cell membrane. It consists of molecules called phosphatidyl phospholipids. And inside those molecules, you find components which are basically fatty acids. There are saturated fatty acids, and there are omega-6s over on the left, AA, that's that orange box, arachidonic acid. And over on the right, you have omega-3 fatty acids, EPA and DHA. Now, arachidonic acid is basically derived originally from linoleic acid from plant foods, which then filters into the food web, either in the plants that we eat or in the animals that eat those plants that we consume. Those omega-6s are built into the cell membranes, and once you have been challenged, which could be by a microorganism or trauma, Arachidonic acid is a starting point for a necessary inflammatory response. That's how you defend yourself against pathogens and clear away damaged tissue after trauma. So the arachidonic acid is broken down into compounds called eicosanoids. They drive the inflammatory sequence until the threat has been resolved. And at that point, you need to stop the inflammatory sequence. You do not want to let it rage out of control because that leads to too much tissue damage. And that is where the omega-3s come in over on the right. EPA and DHA are derived from marine foods, bivalves such as oysters and mussels, but also from oily fish. And if you want to be a vegetarian or a vegan, from the marine algae that are at the bottom of the marine food web that produce those fatty acids. And they break down into anti-inflammatory eicosanoids and other compounds called resolvins, protectins, and maressins, which stop inflammation. Maressin actually stands for a macrophage mediator, which resolves inflammation, but maressin it also derives from the sea, from mare, both of those things. So you have the omega-6s, which drive inflammation, the omega-3s come down and stop it. And the metaphor that most people, I think, can identify with is this is like having the brake and the accelerator on a car. And just as you need both the brake and the accelerator to negotiate your way through heavy traffic, you need to have the accelerator, the omega-6s, and you need to have the brake, the omega-3s, to negotiate your way past the challenges that life throws at you. Here's another slightly different way of looking at it. That box now in the top, the lipid mediators, that is that cell membrane. And that's where the omega-6s and the 3s are. But that's only the first element in the inflammatory cascade. What happens in that box, in the membrane, the beginnings of this inflammation sequence is determined by the ratio of omega-6s and omega-3s. Now these cells, neutrophils, macrophages, and other immune cells are constantly releasing exosomes into the extracellular space. They're spitting them out into the spaces between the cells. And these exosomes contain all kinds of information, mRNAs, mediators of different kinds, but they also contain compounds, enzymes called matrix metalloproteases. Now, matrix metalloproteases are a bit like the enzymes that you find in biological washing powders. They are very, very powerful, and they are fundamentally destructive. These matrix metalloproteases cause tissue destruction. But if you're eating a healthy diet, first of all, you'll have the right 6:3 ratio, not too high. So that first chamber in this sequence is ticking over at a normal rate. But your diet will also contain polyphenols. And these are substances derived from spices, from berry fruits. And they are the key constituents or components in many traditional herbal remedies. They were first identified as vitamin P by the great Hungarian biochemist Albert St. George, one of my favorite scientists, in fact, a man with a very interesting political past as well as a scientific past. His work was really, I won't say suppressed, but it was helped to be forgotten by the pharmaceutical industry because while the vitamin P extract were extremely good anti-inflammatories, they were quite diverse, they were not always consistent, and the pharmaceutical industry was much keener in promoting the sales of their branded drugs. Now, if you're eating the right amounts of 6s and 3s and the right amounts of polyphenols, you will have the right amount of inflammation, enough to ward off dangers, but not enough to cause serious tissue damage. You'll be fine. But this is what the modern diet does. It gives us a ratio of 6s to 3s that is far too high. Instead of being about maybe 2:1 or 3:1, the ratio now, thanks to the multinational food companies, is about 15:1 in Europe, 25:1 in North America. That very high 6:3 ratio means that the first chamber in this inflammatory cascade is overheating. Now, that would probably be okay if you were eating lots of polyphenols, but the modern diet has taken those away as well. The polyphenols have gone, which means that the matrix metalloproteases are now being released in large amounts over long periods of time, and they cause tissue destruction because those matrix metalloproteases, what they do is they dissolve the extracellular matrix. This is a three-dimensional mesh of microfibers that runs through every cubic micrometer of your body, holding all your cells together so that they can communicate with each other, they can coordinate and function collectively. There are many different kinds of fibers. There's 7 or 8 different types of collagen. You've heard about collagen in beauty products. They don't work. And the reason they don't work is there are more than just collagen fibers. There are also laminectin. There's also aminoglycans, glycosaminoglycans, proteoglycans, a range of other microfibers. And the proportion of these different microfibers is variable. It varies in different parts of this matrix depending on what that matrix, what its function actually is. So in some parts of the body, that matrix, its main role may be in retaining fluid. In other parts, it may be to confer elasticity or tensile strength. So this matrix is very variable, very versatile, and it is in fact an organ system in its own right. But those matrix metalloproteases break down every single different one of these fibers. The collagens, the elastins, the laminectins, and everything else. So basically, the organization of your tissues, your organs, starts to disintegrate and you turn into goulash, to use a very common Hungarian word. Now, these enzymes are the same enzymes that are produced by flesh-eating bacteria. These bacteria are entirely destructive, and you can see that the enzymes they produce are dissolving everything: skin, ligaments, cartilage, bone. And these are the same enzymes that are released in much smaller amounts over much smaller, longer periods of time that lead to the gradual destruction of the cartilage in your joints, the osteoid in your bones, the linings of your arteries. This is the core of chronic degenerative disease, and these are the companies that are causing it. Because they sell us junk food, ultra-processed food, which is nutritionally completely defective. None of these foods is toxic if you eat on its own or just for a short period of time. But if your diet contains large amounts of these foods, it will make you ill and it will make you dead because, amongst other things, it causes chronic inflammation. And it does so in different ways. It takes away the omega-3s. So the 6-to-3 ratio is very high, and it takes away the polyphenols. So 2 of your most important anti-inflammatory nutrients have been taken away from your diet. And then the industry takes away 2 more, prebiotics, which are very important to prevent excessive inflammation in the intestines, and 1,3,1,6 beta-glucans, which means that parts of your immune system cannot function properly. So 4 of the most important anti-inflammatory nutrients have gone, and the food industry replaces those with advanced glycation end products, advanced lipoxidation end products, and lipopolysaccharides. And why they do it and how they do it is a little bit complicated. I won't go into that now, but you see they've taken away 4 important anti-inflammatories. They've now giving us 3 pro-inflammatories. Then they give us a 4th, all that sugar. We eat vast amounts of sugar, and it's hidden in foods where you might not expect to see it, which means that the average American is now eating probably anywhere between, I don't think it's 130 pounds anymore, that's a little bit out of date, but probably between 80 and 110 pounds of sugar every year, which is almost a quarter of all the calories that they're going to eat all year. So this is a diet of ultra-processed foods, which is definitely going to cause chronic inflammation, which means increased and accelerated destruction of healthy tissue in many different parts of the body. But this diet does even more than that because it also makes it more difficult for you to repair the tissue that has been damaged. And it does that by causing malnutrition. Now, until recently, the medical profession have not really recognized this because what they learned in their textbooks was this kind of malnutrition, type A, which you might see in developing countries, but we do not see in Hungary or Poland or Czechoslovakia or the United States, at least very, very rarely. What we see is type B malnutrition, where people have, over on the right, you can see they have enough or maybe too many calories. But when you look at their vitamins, their trace elements, their fiber types, carotenoids, xanthophylls, polyphenols, they're low. They're low in almost everything. Luckily, we know what that looks like, and it looks like this. These kids are eating burgers, shakes, and fries. They have chronic inflammation. They have type B malnutrition. And as a result, their bodies are breaking down faster than they can heal them. They already have in their bodies the beginnings of many different chronic degenerative diseases, from coronary artery disease to progressive liver disease to osteoporosis to dementia. And I think they look to me as if they're dementing already. So what are these ultra-processed foods? Well, this is one scheme, the NOVA scheme. And basically, it says, well, processed foods you can still recognize, ultra-processed foods you can't. When you look at them, you cannot see what's in them. They have many different ingredients, typically 6 or more. And these are some examples. So full-fat Coke, Mountain Dew, things like that, candy, ice cream, breakfast cereals, all the things you love. And you love these things because the food industry designs them to be addictive, but not to satiate. They do not satisfy the appetite. So if you eat those foods, you eat more calories than you need. And that means, over time, you gain weight. These foods make you fat. One of the reasons why people are getting heavier, which creates this paradox. The people who are the heaviest, who have the most calories, are those who are eating the most of these ultra-processed foods, and they have the worst nutrition as a result. Now, the more of these foods you eat, the more you die. And that's why life expectancy is starting to fall. In fact, with every 10% more of these foods that you eat, the risk of cancer goes up by 10%, diabetes by 15%, early death by 14%. And if you feed these foods to rats, and rats love them just as much as humans do, it accelerates the aging of the immune system, more inflammation, and an increased risk of sepsis, which is a very important cause of death. And just remember that, because we see that increasingly in humans too. So in the United States, death rates has been falling for 4 years, not just deaths of despair, suicides and overdoses, but diabetic complications, neurodegenerative disease, and their sepsis, just like those lab rats. We have all become lab rats in a huge, out of control dietary experiment that has been forced upon us by these unscrupulous lobbies, such as the multinational food companies, the sugar industry, and various other players have been involved. I won't go into all of that because it becomes very political. So death rates have been falling for 4 years in the United States, 3 years in the United Kingdom, and they're starting to fall now in vulnerable groups in a number of other countries, particularly those countries who are eating the most ultra-processed foods. So you can see that North America is number one because Americans and Canadians are eating 60% or 55% respectively of all of their calories in the form of these terrible ultra-processed foods. Britain comes in next, and then you've got Ireland, Germany, Poland, and Finland. And this situation is getting worse as the food companies drive their toxic, shoddy products into Europe from north to south and from west to east. Even the Mediterranean diet is now dying out. And that's a shame, because if you want to be healthier, eat the Mediterranean diet. It's better than any medicine can do. It will reduce the risk of many different so-called diseases of civilization by between 1/3 and 1/2. But we know of a better, even more effective way to protect yourself now, and this is known as the mid-Victorian diet. Now, if you look at English history, up until about 1850, there were frequent famines. People starved to death. In the second half of that century, everything changes because of the agricultural revolution, huge increases in agricultural productivity, the industrial revolution, a system of transport to bring these foods into the cities, and the way people were working with their backs and their hands. All of this has been published in peer-reviewed journals, and it's a society that's basically blue collar. If you look at how much physical activity they're involved in, is between 60 and 75 hours of physical activity a week. They didn't go to the gym as we do, maybe once or twice a week. They lived and worked in a gym, and that had a huge impact on their need for calories. Very high levels of physical activity. Women are eating between 3,000 and 4,000 calories a day, men between 3,000 and 7,000 calories a day. And yet the photographs of that period show that they're very slim, because they're using all of those calories, they're burning them as fuel. And look at what they're eating. Very little salt, tobacco, spirits, not even much processed food, unless you want to consider things like bread and cheese. Lots of omega-3s, very little omega-6s. Their ratios were about 2 to 1. And we have a ways of calculating this based on food production, food consumption patterns, recipes, many different sources. Lots of polyphenols, because they're eating up to 10 portions of fruit and vegetables a day, which might seem a lot to you. But if you're burning 3,000 to 7,000 calories a day, It's relatively easy. I've actually tried it myself. It's a super Mediterranean diet, and this, if my thesis is correct, should have had a major impact on their health. Let's compare life expectancy. The mid-Victorian women, 73, the equivalent group today, working class women in the 21st century, 76 years. So they've gained 3 years. Actually, that's falling back now. It's been shrunk now to 2.5 years. But that's exclusively due to improved family planning and obstetrics. Look at men. Men have lost 3 years. It's actually now 3.5 years. We're going backwards, despite modern medicine, despite modern surgery and diagnostics, because we're so much sicker than the mid-Victorians were. In fact, they were predominantly healthy. We have plenty of records of mid-Victorians in their 70s, 80s, even in their 90s, who were still capable of putting in full days of physical work in the fields. It's very common. They were generally healthy right until the end. They would go, when they were too old to work in the factory or the fields, to an institution called the workhouse, which meant what it said. We know from the records that they worked to support themselves until the last few days and sometimes minutes before they died, because they had so little degenerative disease. They're living as long as we do, but when you look for things like cancer, heart disease, diabetes, dementia, yes, we see them. The medical records of that period show that doctors could and did diagnose them at the point of death. But the incidence is very low, only 10% of what we see today. Other people have shown this same finding. This is not our data, this is a different group. And these are causes of death in 1997, and they're cancer in the black, and the one above that, circulatory system between them. They kill about 2/3 of the population. This is what we think of as normal. Guess what? In the 19th century, that wasn't normal at all. They were living as long as we do, but the numbers of people with degenerative diseases is only 10% of what we see today. Which tells you two things. Almost 90% of the chronic degenerative disease that is overwhelming our healthcare systems today is unnecessary. It can be avoided. And that 10% who were still getting these diseases back in 1880, we're almost certain that they are the 10% that have been identified today as having strong genetic risk factors. In other words, if you're eating a mid-Victorian diet, you are so protected because you don't have chronic inflammation, you don't have malnutrition, you don't have dysbiosis, you don't have insulin resistance. You are so protected that you will only develop a chronic degenerative disease if you have one of those high-risk denoting genes. Everybody else is safe. I won't go into this. This is rather more detailed analysis of what protected the Victorians and left us vulnerable. So let's consider a 21st century man, a human, who is eating a 21st century diet. If they're eating too many ultra-processed foods, as so many of us do, they have a high 6-to-3 ratio. 15-to-1. No polyphenols, so they have chronic inflammation in different parts of the body, which the doctors might call arthritis or liver disease or lung disease, or could be migraine, could be depression, could be dementia. All of these conditions are known to have a very major chronic inflammatory component. But because this person is eating an ultra-processed diet without prebiotic fibers, they also have a microbiota that is predominantly gram-negative, leading to chronic inflammation in the intestines also. So this is a typical 21st century subject. And those diseases, those conditions will become more severe as time passes, and they will eventually make this person sick and then kill them. So we deal with this by giving this kind of person a blend of omega-3s and polyphenols, which improves the omega 6-to-3 ratio and puts polyphenols back into the system. And as many of you know or have experienced, this is enough to stop inflammation in many tissues. But there's more. We need to change the situation in the intestines. You see, the omega-3s and the polyphenols in balanced oil are absorbed in the small intestine long before the food or anything that you've ingested arrives in the lower intestine, and that's where dysbiosis takes place. So here we have to use a different set of tools, and what we use is xenobiotic, which is a time-released blend of prebiotic fibers. And when you do that, then chronic inflammatory stress in the intestines disappears as well. Now you're starting to move back to health. So what are these prebiotic fibers? Well, they're food not for you exactly, but they're food for the microbes that live inside the intestines, specifically the large bowel. There are gram-positive microbes, those are those little things in green there, that prefer to eat prebiotic fibers. And because they like to eat prebiotic fiber, they stay in the lumen of the gut. And then some of them get into the outer mucosal layer of the gut, but basically they're in the space in the middle of the gut because they want to get access to those prebiotic fibers. And they digest them, they ferment them technically, breaking them down into short chain fatty acids, including one fatty acid called butyrate, which is a very interesting molecule because butyrate is anti-inflammatory and it's very good at killing cancer cells. So by eating prebiotic fibers, you encourage the growth of these probiotic species, which already live inside you, and they tell your cells, those ones on the bottom, those which we call colonocytes, do not be inflamed, do not be cancerous. This is a healthy situation. What the multinational food companies have done is they have removed prebiotic fibers from the diet, so the gram-positive bacteria are starving. They die off, their numbers shrink, they are replaced by gram-negative microbes, and what the gram-negative microbes prefer to eat, many of them, is mucin. That is the compounds which are important in building up the mucosal layers that lie on top of the colonocytes at the bottom. So they're nibbling away at this mucosal layer, they destroy it. These gram-negative cells come into direct contact with the colonocytes, and because they're coated with lipopolysaccharide, that's why they're gram-negative, they cause huge amounts of inflammation. When that causes problems not only inside the intestines, but in many other tissues of the body. And this is why IBS and IBD has become so very common in Europe, North America, and in all the developed countries today. These are diseases of civilization. So what should we do? We put the prebiotic fibers back into the diet. We feed the good bacteria. They multiply, they produce compounds which actually kill off the gram-negative bacteria. Not all of them, but they bring the numbers down. So the balance now switches back to being gram-positive dominant. Now, once again, they're producing butyrate and bathing our cells in a solution which is anti-inflammatory and anti-cancer. This is a healthy environment. This is what those prebiotics look like. This fructose oligosaccharides known as FOS. They are built up, as you can see, of sugar molecules, but we cannot digest these. We cannot break them down in the small intestine. They do not contribute to blood sugar levels. They pass intact through the small intestine and into the large bowel, where they are fermented by the gram-positive microbes. We also use inulin, same molecule, but longer, so the fermentation is slower. None of these fibers are enough on their own. You have to combine them with other fibers, such as oat beta-glucans, 1,3,1,4 beta-glucans, longer fibers, so the fermentation is slower. And then we use larger amounts of resistant starch from sources such as green banana, much larger molecule, much more complicated. The fermentation is slower again. We have to get all the proportions right. We have to have all of them present because once this blend of fibers enters the large intestine, everything is moving. And so it is the short molecules, the FOS, which ferment first and start changing the microbiome from negative to positive. And then the inulin comes in, and then the 1,3,1,4 beta-glucans, and then the resistant starch. It's like a relay race. It's not as neat as this. Obviously, there's plenty of overlap, but that's just a diagrammatic way of making the general point. According to the WHO, this will be enough to increase the risk of early death by 30% because it is profoundly protective against cancer and vascular diseases, the two most important causes of death in our society today. Just as important as getting your 6:3 ratio right. These fibers are very, very important, crucial for your prolonged good health. According to the WHO analysis, and I think that their data is really excellent, you really need a minimum dose of about 30 grams a day. But the problem is most people don't eat enough fiber, 9 out of 10 do not, and the average intake is only 15 grams, half the minimum recommendation. And out of that, only a quarter is prebiotic fiber, 3.5 grams. Now, if the WHO is right, then we think you need at least 7 grams of mixed prebiotic fibers a day, which is 1 single scoop of xenobiotic. I would go further. I think that the evidence is you get even better protection if you take 2 scoops, which is about 12 to 14 grams. At that point, your entire microbiome has been shifted all the way over from gram-negative dominant to gram-positive dominant, and I have seen all kinds of patients respond fantastically well to this general approach. 2 more sources of chronic inflammation, and one of those is the pockets of fat deep inside the abdomen. You know how dangerous the apple shape is. It seems to be bad for your health, whereas adipose tissue under the skin, there is some evidence that may actually be protective. And one of the reasons is that the deep pockets of adipose tissue in the abdomen, it's infiltrated. It tends to be infiltrated by immune cells, such as macrophages, which break down the lipids and form compounds called adipokines, which cause inflammation, not just in the fat tissue itself, but in the tissues all around it. You can lose this fat. Difficult to do it by dieting. Really, you need to go through programs of rigorous physical exercise. If you can do that, fine. If you can't, you can neutralize this type of fat with a group of fat-soluble phytonutrients, which we have put into Extend. So that's one way of stopping that source of chronic inflammation. But there is one more, which we shouldn't forget, and that is periodontal disease. I think any dentist will tell you how very common that is. And it's really chronic inflammation and dysbiosis in the mouth. So if when you brush your teeth, you see a spot of blood in the sink afterwards, do not dismiss it. It's serious because this process is forming toxic metabolites, inflammatory compounds, which are able to get into the brain through the olfactory nerve, we think, increase the risk of Alzheimer's, Parkinsonism, and stroke. And because you're swallowing them as well, increasing the risk of problems elsewhere in the body as well. This is a very unhealthy condition. It would be wise, if you have the signs of periodontal disease, to do something about it. Now, you can choose to go to the dentist once every 6 months and have the roots of your teeth scraped, which I absolutely hate. And if you're anything like me, it's something you'll put off for as long as you can. Fortunately, there is an alternative. Not the fish this time, but the seaweed. When you pick seaweed out of the ocean, the first thing you'll notice is how slippery it is. That's because seaweeds are covered with a kind of anti-fouling compound, a non-stick compound, a biological equivalent to Teflon. And those compounds are called fucoidans. These are, I feel sorry for the interpreter. They are polysulfated oligosaccharides. I'm sorry, excuse me, Mr. Translator, that must be really difficult. Now, when you eat these compounds, you absorb them, some of them, they get into the blood, into the saliva, they coat the roots of the teeth with this kind of biological Teflon. And when that happens, the plaque disappears within 24 hours. And you can tell that, you can see that for yourself by using a plaque disclosing tablet you can get from your dentist. It doesn't go away completely, but it largely disappears. After about 2 or 3 weeks, the tartar, which is mineralized plaque, falls off the roots of your teeth. When that happens, inflammation stops, the gums stop bleeding, and some Japanese studies show that when that happens, the teeth, which may have become loose, start to anchor themselves down into the gums, into the maxilla and the mandible. They root themselves back into place. This is quite new and very exciting. So by taking these fucoidans, these rather complicated seaweed extracts, you can we're putting them into Extend, or we may add them into a separate dental health product. Basically, the chronic inflammatory stress, the dysbiosis in the mouth disappears. And when that happens, all the other risk factors disappear as well. Now, I don't think it's a good idea to recommend medicines or supplements to anyone who doesn't need them. So I strongly recommend that people take a balance test first. If you have really good results here, you probably don't need the sorts of things we can supply because you're already eating a very healthy diet. That's fine. Congratulations. That if the test tells you that you do have a high 6-to-3 ratio, it's a good indication that your diet is far away from where it should be. And at that point, you should seriously consider doing something about it, which is what we try to do in our portfolio. So for chronic inflammatory stress anywhere in the tissues, with the exception of the large intestine. We have this combination of omega-3s and polyphenols, which works extremely well. In the gastrointestinal tract, these blended time-release prebiotic fibers. In deep fat, and in periodontal disease, and as a treatment for type B malnutrition, we have Extend. As I said, that periodontal aspect may be separated from Extend and put into a separate product. That's still being discussed at the moment. But this is the first systems approach to dealing with the problems that are caused by the modern diet and lifestyle. The modern diet and lifestyle cause chronic inflammation, dysbiosis, malnutrition type B. And that is what our portfolio is designed to counteract. The overall impact is to give your nutritional profile and then your metabolism is to take it back 150 years so that we hope you can enjoy the same good health that the mid-Victorians did. All we're doing is we're trying to compensate for the immorality, the criminal irresponsibility of today's food industry. They have removed all these important elements from your diet, and all we are doing is restoring them. It's a very simple story. So thank you, and I hope that there will be enough time for at least some questions and answers. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Paul, for sharing with us all these information. And I must tell you that it's clearly visible that people are eager to learn from you as well. And especially these times, it's really important that people are a little bit more self-conscious and taking care of themselves as well. So I would like to ask you only one question before we let you go. And it's pretty obvious that nowadays people are asking all the time regarding COVID-19 and COVID-19 and the relation between Zinzino products and the virus. So can we tell to our relatives, to our friends with a good heart that we can recommend the products?
Well, to start with, I don't think we should be so scared of COVID-19, although the politicians would like us to be, and the pharmaceutical industry would like us to be. It's not a serious virus. The fatality rate is less than 0.5%, and the government's idiotic responses to this pandemic have killed far more people than have died from the virus itself. The majority of people who are infected have no symptoms. The majority of the people who have symptoms recover. It is only a very small number who then go on to become ill and die. And they are largely 75 years plus, or they have serious pre-existing health conditions. And many of the deaths that are currently being described as COVID deaths, there are people not who died of COVID, they died with COVID. They were already in death's antechamber. And all that COVID did was it gave them that last little push over the edge. But basically, they were dying or close to death already. I think that there has been a disastrous convergence of interests between the pharmaceutical industry and politicians, a toxic mixture of desire for profits and power, which has created an entirely unnecessary and unproductive series of public health pronouncements, both here in North America and throughout Europe. So let us not be scared of COVID. Lockdowns don't work, we know that now. Masks have very little impact. I didn't bother to even wear a mask or wash my hands or avoid crowds when COVID first came out. I wasn't worried about it. I knew I would find it eventually, or it would eventually find me. And I got COVID, been tested, and I was, it was a little bit like a mild flu. I felt, slightly headachy, slight sore throat and a cough for 7 to 10 days. End of story. And I'm 70. I'm theoretically in an at-risk group, but I have a healthy immune system and I have good nutrition, which gives me a better chance of fighting it off. How does the immune system fight it off? Well, a large part of your immune defenses to bacterial infections are cellular, not exclusively, but predominantly. But most of your defense elements against viral infections boil down to chemical substances, mild oxidants, including hydrogen peroxide, hypochlorous acid, hypoiodide, and hypothiocyanate and hypothiocyanate ions. And you require various nutrients in your diet to be able to make these substances, these compounds, which are very good at not killing the virus. You can't kill a virus, but altering its chemical structure so that it can no longer enter cells. For those of you who are technical, who perhaps are virologists, these are substances which are able to oxidize the sulfhydryl groups that you find on the surface of many viruses and which are involved in viral cell recognition, binding, and then that subsequent invasion reproduction cycle. It just so happens that the micronutrients that you need and phytonutrients that you need for your body to produce all these compounds, levels of them have declined very significantly in our diet for the last 50 or perhaps 100 years for some of the reasons that I talked about earlier in this presentation. My advice to you would be to put them back into your system. And in fact, Extend was designed in a way to do that. Extend is called Extend because it was designed to treat disease X. Now, disease X does not exist. It was a nightmare conjured up by the WHO, I think 2, maybe 3 years ago. And they were speculating about a viral disease that would come out of nowhere and have high transmission rates and virulence factors. You know, the Andromeda strain, if you have ever seen that movie. And I was thinking, well, if something like this emerges, and I suppose one day it might, and believe me, COVID-19 is not that. If that emerged, how could we protect ourselves? And I developed Extend deliberately as a strategy of helping people to mount better immune responses to viruses. I can only speak from my personal experience. I think it helped me to deal with COVID-19 more effectively and get back to work quickly. So I'm not saying this is a cure. If I were to say that, then the regulators would immediately break down my front door and drag me off to jail because we are treading on the toes of some very major vested financial interests. We would be going up against the pharmaceutical industry, which makes enormous amounts of money from selling vaccines, many of which are not properly tested, which are potentially dangerous, and where they have, using political leverage, gained immunity from prosecution, even if they damage you. This is a toxic political situation. And I've already said about as much as I can without risking imprisonment.
Well, thank you so much, Paul. I guess you answered and covered the question and all this thing pretty well. And we don't want you to risk yourself or anything saying those things. So I'm pretty sure that because of the enormous interest that more than 1,000 people were in the room and others were waiting outside, we might meet another time pretty soon. We don't know when, but I hope we meet each other soon and we can listen to you again with all these people throughout Eastern Europe.
Well, so, that's only if I can get onto Zoom from my jail cell.
That wouldn't be possible, so please take care of yourself.
Okay.
Thank you again, Paul, for having us tonight, and we really appreciate all the knowledge and especially your precious time. So take care.
Not at all. My job is to support you. I really want to improve public health, which I find insulting and offensive. I want to make it better, and I need your help to achieve something like that.
Yeah, we are working on it as a team. So thank you again, Paul, and we hope that we'll see each other pretty soon on Zoom.
Okay. Thank you so much. Bye-bye.
Thank you. Bye, Paul. Bye.